Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 557 through 559, which will cover manga chapters 636 through 638. And this is the chance for the Straw Hat crew to really show off their newfound powers against the grunts of the new fishermen pirates. Alright, so synopsis. With over 50,000 men still remaining, the Straw Hats begin to show off their new powers to thin out the crowd as a few of the fishermen pirate officers begin to enter the fray, while Luffy faces off against Hody himself. However, a new wrench is thrown into all of this as the Noah is now approaching on a collision course with the island seeking Shirahoshi. Alright, so differences. So there are a couple of them. There's that really funny scene of Chopper and Usopp essentially playing whack-a-mole versus Daruma. This is added in the anime, but I personally love this as it obviously calls back to Arabasta versus Miss Merry Christmas, which I'll talk about later. Another change I'm not a fan of because it changes kind of the dynamic and perception of Luffy and his newfound strength is that in the anime when Luffy goes in for his first set of attacks on Hody, it shows him activating Gear Second, but in the manga he doesn't do this and just kind of beats him up down, purely with Haki. And this scene, I feel like, is to show Luffy's massive upgrade from learning Haki and showing just how powerful armament Haki can be in enhancing someone's power, yet the anime kind of waters it down a bit by including him using Gear Second. And I get that it's not that big of a deal, but subconsciously, it is different when you see Luffy using Gear Second and not using it. I think for me, you see him kicking this much ass with just armament Haki, and you're kind of thinking in the back of your mind, like, holy crap, imagine how strong he'd be if he paired these with his gears, which also kind of takes away from the big moment when he actually does eventually use them in combination with each other later in the fight. So yeah, I don't like this change, but again, it is a minuscule one that ultimately really doesn't matter too much. It's just more on a sort of subconscious level of how you perceive this fight in Luffy. There's a couple small added scenes like Tsurume protecting Shirahoshi from like a trio of fishermen pirates. And then there's also another scene where Luffy says how Hody isn't as strong as Jinbei, with Jinbei kind of agreeing with him. These are just fun little scenes that are added which don't really change too much other than to elongate the episode. But ultimately, it's not that bad. Another change is when the princes return to the fight, the order in which their scenes play out is reversed. In the anime, Fukaboshi comes in to save Luffy first, and then Manboshi and Ryuboshi show up to save Shirahoshi against Dekken. But in the manga, it's actually reversed, and I actually kind of like having Fukaboshi as the final reveal since he's the eldest and the most prominent, and he's also the one saving Luffy. And so I like that it's sort of this build-up where we see Manboshi and Ryuboshi protecting Shirahoshi, and then we see Fukaboshi show up to save Luffy. I like that sort of progression rather than the reverse for some reason. I don't know, it just doesn't quite land as powerfully as it could have. Another change is in that same kind of set of scenes is Hody doesn't actually pop Luffy's bubble. He's just kind of shown looming over him in this big, shadowy, intimidating pose. And then it swaps to the Fukaboshi Manboshi and Ryuboshi saving Shirahoshi. And actually, this is an anime change where I do like it because it gives that moment where Fukaboshi saves Luffy a bit more tension. And then finally, there's also an added additional scene where Shirahoshi rejects Dekken again by saying that she's not her type. This one, I don't know, I could take it or leave it. It's just, again, filler. It's just to elongate the episode length. And yeah, I mean, this is literally just repeating the same scene from earlier. There are quite a few other little really minor changes that I didn't really list here, but those are pretty much the big ones. So yeah, let's get into the episodes themselves. So the fight is pretty much in favor of the Straw Hats at this point, but the officers have yet to mobilize, so that could change the tide, with Hyozo taking an interest in the two swordsmen of the crew in Brook and Zoro, while Daruma is the first to actually engage any of the Straw Hats. And this is a pretty fun callback to Arabasta's fight versus Miss Merry Christmas, with Chopper and Usopp again teaming up to take on a person with mole-like abilities. And yet again, they have to play whack-a-mole against them, just like Usopp had to do with his Usopp Pound attack. But this time, he's got to do it with a tank. And the characters themselves will actually acknowledge this connection later on in the battle in the setup episodes we'll cover in a future podcast episode. But now Daruma has some references to both the techniques he uses here that I kind of wanted to point out. The first being the cookie cutter, which is what he refers to as when he's burrowing and tunneling through the ground like a mole. But this is, of course, like we've talked about in a past episode, referring to the type of fish that he's based off of, which is the cookie cutter shark. The second is his Daruma Otoshi attack, which is what he uses to drop the Brachio tank into the hole. Daruma is, of course, his name, which is a reference to the Japanese Daruma doll, again, like I've mentioned in the past. And this is referencing the children's game involving a Daruma doll. So Daruma Otoshi translates to Daruma drop. The game involves you stacking several wooden cylindrical blocks with the Daruma sitting at the top of this stack, and the goal is to knock the center cylindrical blocks out from underneath it with a little hammer without toppling the Daruma off of the stack. So of course, this is kind of in reference to Daruma dropping the Brachio tank. Now, Franky tries to come in for the save, but then he gets caught in a pitfall that's obvious from a mile away. But part of me always likes to think that he did this intentionally so that it would put him in position for the big reveal he's about to do with both vehicles. And he gets it going with his trademark hentai transformation wordplay joke with Usopp exclaiming that you already are a hentai or pervert. But again, pervert and transformation can both be said here as hentai, which Franky often uses for comedic purposes. But it's here we finally get to see a true mech suit transformation that was just a pipe dream back on Thriller Bark with the Tactics 15 moment. And like that scene, this takes full advantage of the long history of Japanese mech suit-up scenes like with Power Rangers or Voltron and the Megazord and whatnot. But the Kurosai bike becomes the arms, which is why the FRU is part of the name for Franky no Ude or Franky's arm, and the Brachio tank becoming the torso and legs of what would become the Iron Pirate or Franky Shogun, or General Franky as it's referred to in English. To which everyone seeing this freaks out, especially Luffy, Usopp, and Chopper, and rightfully so because this thing looks absolutely awesome, complete with its own pop-out sword. Now the sword itself has its own wordplay in Japanese as well. It's called the Franken, which is just a mashup of Franky and the word sword in Japanese, which is ken. And you can also see, like with all of Franky's creations, since he was a kid, bears the number of BF-number designation, with himself being BF number 37, and then the General Franky being BF 38. One interesting detail that Franky mentions that you'd only really understand if you read the cover stories is that in addition to using Vegapunk's notes to help him build the suit, that the suit itself is made of Wappo metal. Now, this metal was first introduced in Wappo's cover story, which if you need a refresher on that story, you can listen to episode 70 of this podcast, where I do a full recap and breakdown of that story. But the short of it is that after Wappo's defeat to Luffy on Drum, he becomes homeless and begins to eat random garbage and starts making toys for local kids and accidentally discovers this new incredibly strong metal alloy, which he can make by eating certain things and then basically pooping them out, I guess, which he then turns into a business empire. And this metal alloy is so good that he uses it to deal his way back into the King's Summit with the world government. Another thing to note here is that among the random fishmen's stunned reactions to the General Franky suit, there's a Panda Man sighting mixed in there at the 11-minute 31-second mark in the Crunchyroll stream. And then again, there's also another Panda Man sighting just a couple minutes later, which I imagine it's the same one we saw in that first moment. But at the 12-minute 26-second mark, where the fishermen soldiers are all trying not to be intimidated by the General Franky, and then they begin to charge him, you can see Panda Man kind of off to the side, also charging as well. Now, his first attack is ridiculous and hilarious using the Franken. He spins around, dubbing it the General Watch Your Step, but in Japanese, this attack's name is absurd. It's called the General Ashimoto Dangerous, which translated is General Dangerous Footing, but it's just a mismatch of like Japanese and English and broken grammar, which makes this name so funny when you hear it in Japanese. But just like in true Franky fashion, there's always an inefficient twist with this as he reveals the Franky cannon, and the build-up, you're just waiting for the shoe to drop on this twist, and as the finale, it reveals itself with the Franky cannon as you and the characters get hyped for this shoulder-mounted cannon to appear, but instead, Franky pops out of the chest and does the cannon firing himself from his own shoulders, just like every other Franky attack. Particularly, the one that always gets me was on the Puffing Tom when he does the Franky centaur and the legs pop out from the front. I think that's my favorite example of just like these weird twisted versions of Franky's attacks. And then to kind of cap off this action scene is he boasts about the fact that there's another new weapon to which he announces as the general weight. And it's literally him just falling over on top of a bunch of enemies. It's not even really like a weapon. It's just him falling over. It's just ridiculous, but I do find this scene pretty funny. Meanwhile, Nami gets a little moment to shine where she's almost attacked and she deflects. And I mention this mostly because I love her line here about how she's not weak, she's just chicken. Like, I love that Nami doesn't actually view herself as weak. She's just afraid most of the time to actually do anything, which I think is an important distinction and shows her character as being confident in her abilities despite how she's constantly scared of things. And I do like the Gus sword attack. After Nami, Chopper then gets a chance to show off his new power-ups with the confirmation that he can in fact use his 7 transformations freely without relying on the Rumble Ball, just as we predicted. Now only needing it for 1 transformation, and we can all pretty much guess which it is at this point because the 8th, or I guess the 9th transformation, which is not included in the visual that's kind of behind him so far, is the monster point. So it stands to reason that he's somehow managed to gain the ability to perhaps control it now. However, the fact that he proudly calls himself a monster is something that I love that brings Chopper's character full circle, and we'll get into this a bit more later in a future podcast episode. So one thing about Chopper's new forms is that you will probably notice, and this is I guess kind of spoiler, but you'll probably notice as the series goes on that he almost never uses arm point or jumping point anymore. They're almost completely absent. In fact, I don't think... And I'd have to do research on this, and I apologize I didn't do research on this earlier, but to my recollection, I don't think he's ever used arm point or jumping point in post-time skip, like actual canon or filler material, really, now that I think about it. In fact, I think the only time I've ever seen post-time skip arm point is actually in the game One Piece Odyssey. He actually uses it, but... beyond that, he's never actually used it in the anime or manga. And so, yeah, it's really interesting how he doesn't use it. I can see why he doesn't necessarily need jumping point anymore because Kung Fu point basically allows him to jump like crazy anyways. So I think that's kind of redundant at this point. But yeah, not having arm point is a little strange, I feel like. But overall, I know his new designs for his 7 transformations, or I guess now 9 transformations now that he has total, it's kind of hit or miss for me. I like Horn Point now. I think it looks pretty good. Brain Point's pretty much the same. Walk Point, he just looks more like a reindeer than he did even when he previously turned into Walk Point. I think my least favorite, though, is Heavy Point. Like, I think it's fine for the most part. I just don't like that, like, crazy... I don't know what it is. Like, the mane that he has on his neck. Like, it's almost like he's wearing, like, a... I don't know, like a lifesaver around his neck. It's really weird. And then, yeah, Kung Fu Point, it's fine. I think it's a reference to Kung Fu Panda with sort of the fat Po, the panda. Yeah, and then it's just like, it's really strange how he doesn't use arm point anymore at all. It's never brought up. So, yeah, I do feel like Chopper kind of goes by the wayside a little bit and gets a little neglected post-time skip compared to what he was in pre-time skip. But overall, I think I like the new redesigns for all of his transformations. Oh, one moment I really love that I kind of forgot about until I rewatched these episodes is the moment between Luffy and Tsurume. So Hody is threatening Tsurume's brother's life and holding him hostage, which leaves Tsurume no choice but to obey Hody and strangle Shirahoshi. But the way Luffy handles this situation is so amazing. He doesn't get angry or hostile or even try to persuade him right off the bat. Luffy, instead, using his insane genius level emotional and social intelligence, chooses to empathize with Tsurume by acknowledging that he's been put in a difficult position. And instead of dismissing Tsurume's worries or even taking them over, Luffy, by saying something like, "Don't worry, I'll take care of Hody," like, instead, first off, Luffy actually connects with Tsurume by taking the small amount of time to learn about Tsurume and his brother, showing that he does in fact care by asking if it's his older or younger brother. And you get the sense that Luffy understood the answer, even though we never explicitly hear what was said. And as Luffy has this sort of uncanny ability to communicate with animals, whether it was Shushu or the Lapern, like it's not to mention, to Luffy, the idea of saving one's brother is a very personal experience he shares with what went down with both Ace and Sabo. Additionally, and this was really expertly worded, instead of just taking over the situation, like saying, I'll save him for you, he gives agency to Tsurume over his own brother's fate by saying, let me help you save him too, and then thereby creating this environment where they're both working together. And he's involving him in the effort to save his brother. I just think that's genius on Luffy's part, and also great dialogue from Oda. Like, that's like masterclass on how you can win people over by taking the time to understand them and then meeting them where they are. And I absolutely love this. And I can't believe I forgot about this scene, this like small scene, even though I've, read Fishman Island probably the least amount of times, like I've said, but I've still reread it and rewatched it quite a few times. But despite Luffy's sort of smiley and happy demeanor to Tsurume and Shirahoshi, after learning that Hody is keeping Tsurume's brother hostage, this pisses Luffy off and he just turns serious. And I love that at this point, the crew is so strong that essentially the tables have kind of flipped from pre-time skip. Instead of Luffy having to struggle to get to the main bad guy, his crew, especially the two other Monster Trio members, essentially can just casually pave the way for Luffy straight to Hody in the face of his officers. It's such a badass moment to see Luffy just confidently march down the road while Sanji and Zoro flank him and just completely protect him like it's nothing. It's so cool. And I love this sort of reversal of what we've been experiencing up till this point, that now Luffy is the one in charge, and you can slowly see the shift from Luffy being this sort of underestimated rookie pirate to slowly becoming sort of one of the big boys in the new world. And it's a really cool thing to see. And it's clear that Luffy is well beyond Hody, even with the crazy steroid power-up, as it's pretty clear that Hody isn't even as strong as Jinbei. And now with Haki, Luffy has taken a huge leap in power from being able to control Gear Second better and not have it, eat up his own stamina, the ability to read attacks with Observation Haki, and a boost in offensive and defensive strength with Armament Haki. It's almost a little startling just how significant of a jump he's taken. I do find it hilarious, though, that early on, to make it very clear when he's using Haki, he will literally yell out Busosho Koka or, armament hardening before he's using it. It seems really impractical and unnecessary. At least he doesn't yell out Kenbunshoku no Haki when he's like dodging stuff. But yeah, I do find it funny that the anime trope of him yelling stuff. But this time it's just like he's yelling his own power-ups, not even just the attacks. So I think now is a good time to talk about Armament Haki and its sort of visual representation, because it's a very confusing topic even to many longtime fans. And even to me, I'm not 100% clear exactly how all of it works. So even to this day, there's a lot of confusion whether the black coating that appears whenever someone uses Armament Haki is actually visible to the characters within the story, or if it's just a way for Oda to visually indicate to us, the reader or the viewer, when Armament Haki is actually being used, but it's not actually being seen by the characters in the story. There's also a separate but related theory that it is visible to the characters in the story, but only to those who've unlocked the ability to use Haki themselves, which is what people have kind of used to explain why, despite there being moments that Armament Haki was being used, but not visible in the pre-time skip era, like when Rayleigh deflected Kizaru's potential killing blow on Zoro in the Sabodi Island, for example. Now, for a long time, I actually believed that it was only a visual cue for us, the viewer. But when looking at the story and with the hindsight of future chapters and episodes and the context from some of the movies and stuff, it's become pretty clear that it is visible to the characters in the story in particular moments. They do see the black coating for sure. A couple things that point to this, but unfortunately I can't talk about some of that stuff due to spoilers, but I can kind of create a separate spoiler section later. So if you want to hear that reasoning, you can, but I'll try and keep the spoilers limited to just related to Haki related stuff. I'd say the most confusing part is on Oda himself due to the fact that he's often really inconsistent with how he represents and utilizes Haki in general throughout the whole story. Not just specifically with armament Haki, but especially during the pre-time skip era when Oda hadn't quite fleshed out the power system of Haki and hadn't really decided to use sort of the black visual representation. So in essence, a lot of this really comes down to Oda he hadn't really planned this one out, unlike a lot of the other things he does on a genius level. But if we did want to try and explain it, it can kind of be explained by differing levels of degrees to Haki usage. So armament can be used without the black coating coming out, and that will allow you to still attack using Haki and still, hit Logias like Rayleigh. But when they use the specific technique called hardening or Koka, that is when the black coating comes out. This still doesn't really go on to explain why all those highly powerful and skilled people at Marineford never displayed the black coating, though. You'd think at some point they would have used it among the myriad of crazy attacks being thrown at them from the Marines, or the Marines, from the perspective of the Whitebeard pirates throwing crazy attacks at them. And I know that was very confusing and long, but essentially there is plenty of evidence to show that people in the story can see the black coating, but the inconsistency comes from Oda's lack of foresight when implementing armament Haki, especially pre-time skip, but it still happens in post-time skip as well. It seems to only be when somebody's using Koka or hardening, but you can still imbue yourself with armament Haki. It just doesn't necessarily need to be shown as black coating unless you're actually using a more stronger version of it. Anyways, moving on, then the moment we had been expecting has arrived as Noah makes its appearance, but what's surprising is Neptune's extreme reaction to it, as well as the little bits of additional information he refers to as the promised ship, and that nothing can happen to the ship until a certain time, which is very intriguing. Like, who promised who what? And at the time, I didn't really pay much mind at this comment and tiny bit of lore, but it will actually go on to be a very important clue in regard to the overall story, which doesn't really get fleshed out till later in this arc and over the course of the entire series. Like, this is actually a very big first clue for what the Noah is, as well as how it relates to the bigger story. However, the more pressing subject at the moment is that the Noah is on a direct collision course with Fishman Island, and so Shirahoshi selflessly and bravely decides to lead the Noah out of the way and let it chase her, as well as exposing herself from out of the protection of Tsurume and Luffy. Dekken is probably one of my least favorite characters in all of One Piece. I feel like he doesn't really add much to the story, and is just overall not really all that interesting. He's a pretty one-note, two-dimensional, boring, and frankly unpleasant character, and not in a good way. Like, there are well-written villains that you love to hate, but you don't really necessarily like them because they're good people, but they're just good characters. But Dekken is just annoying and unpleasant, as well as it takes away time from characters you actually want to see and learn more of. And this is another element of what holds Fishman Island back for me, is along with Hody and Dekken, who make up the other half of the arc's antagonist force, is just both are bad. I don't really like either of them. Shirahoshi, on the other hand, gets better and better as the arc goes on. Despite having no real combat strength and having been sheltered most of her life, she still shows incredible strength and courage to do what's right, even at the cost of her own life, just like her mother. I just like with every appearance of Shirahoshi and every action she takes, it makes her a much more interesting character, that you see like how much deeper she is with how she thinks, what her values are, what her morals are, and just what kind of a character and person she is. Like, I like her more and more. Like, at first, I was just kind of like lukewarm about her, kind of like just an annoying, weak princess that didn't really do much. It's kind of like your standard damsel in distress. But the more she appears and the more you learn about her, the more interesting she gets. And by this point, I am pretty much on board with Shirahoshi. Like, I like her quite a bit. Maybe not quite as much as I liked Vivi, but Shirahoshi is definitely growing on me by this point in the story with the actions that she takes and her reasoning for those. This, though, leads Luffy to chase after her into the ocean. And one thing that I have to mention, even though it's really pedantic to even mention this, is how Luffy is even able to withstand the water pressure at 10,000 meters underwater. He should be pretty much squished instantly. But I suppose one argument is how Luffy does have, he has basically superhuman strength, and his body is strong enough to withstand the pressures like a fisherman's body can, which does kind of work since Luffy is shown to be just as, if not physically stronger than even most of the strongest fishmen alive. But this is kind of the only way Oda could make this fight even remotely interesting, is to give Luffy this immense handicap of having to fight underwater against a fisherman, which isn't necessarily a bad thing to see how Luffy would handle fighting in an environment like this, which is new to the series. So it is a very novel experience to see Luffy and see how he would handle being given such an immense handicap of both being a devil fruit user and against a fisherman while being a human himself, albeit a superhuman. Another thing that's a bit ridiculous when it comes to physics and logic is when Hody is using his Kirisame attachment to his dorsal fin to slice through the rock formations. They're being depicted as being cut all the way through, but the blade is like at most, 5 to 7 feet long? And he's making one pass at these rock formations that are like the size of skyscrapers. How is he slicing them clean off when the blade probably makes it 10% of the way across their diameter? I mean, I get that it's supposed to look cool, but it's really, really stretching my suspension of disbelief. Again, these are all really nitpicky, but I just find it funny. It's just something I think about when I watch these episodes, especially with how many times I've seen them. You just start to think and start to see all these little things that just don't make sense. But yeah, the episodes end with Hody betraying Decken and stabbing him in the back by stabbing him in the front, and leaving the fate of the Noah up in the air, as we don't know if Decken's ability is one of those that persists after the user is knocked out or killed, like Hancock's Mero petrification powers, or if it will disappear after the user is killed or knocked out. But the next episode, however, I will be taking a detour, so we won't actually get to see what the result of that is, because I will be putting out a special episode for my 200th podcast episode, so I hope you look forward to that. And yeah, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter/X account at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes. I know I've been pretty bad at posting, so I'll try and get better at that. But yeah, it's been pretty busy, so just putting out the episodes themselves has been pretty much all I can do with my time. But yeah. Anyways, as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. Like I mentioned, there will be a brief spoiler section for the hockey and armament stuff. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye. All right, so spoiler section. So yeah, there's a couple things I wanted to talk about that kind of lend to the idea of the fact that the black coating is visible to the people in the story themselves. So probably the biggest one is the fact that black swords exist. We learn later on that the way black swords are created is that they are imbued with incredibly strong haki, and particularly armament haki. And so we can even see later on that characters will use armament haki hardening to coat their weapons and turn them temporarily black. And Zoro uses this quite often in the story as well. And so eventually, if you imbue it with strong enough haki, it will permanently turn black, like the Shusui or Mihawk's sword Yoru. And so yeah, that's if armament haki wasn't visible to people, then those black swords would still be, the regular color of steel, which is more that lighter metallic look rather than just complete black metal. And we know that people can see the black metal because they refer to it as a black sword or a kokuto. And so that's one big reason why we know that people can see the black armament haki. The other one, this one's a little bit more shaky because it's actually referenced in a movie. So in film Z, the main antagonist or villain of that movie, Zephyr, is referred to as the Black Arm because of the fact that he is so proficient in using armament haki, and he coats his arms with the black coating. And so if people can't see that, then how would he ever get that epithet? And some people's argument would be, well, this is a movie, it's non-canon. But Film Z, particularly, along with Strong World, Film Red, and Film Gold, these are movies that, and including Stampede as well. These movies specifically were overseen by Oda. Not only was he an executive producer, but he actually oversaw a little bit of the story as well as the character designs. And so, not to say that he was the creator or the director of these movies, but he did have a larger role in the creation of these movies as opposed to some of the other ones. And so I tend to think that if Oda was overseeing some of the story elements in this movie, he would have kind of pushed back on this idea if people couldn't really see the black. Like, why would you even... I mean, it seems like a really obvious thing to say. No, let's probably stay away from that because people in the universe can't see the black. And so, yeah, I don't think that would be really something that he would have done. So I actually lean more towards believing this, even if it is a non-canon example. The last example of sort of the degrees of this is that later on when Luffy activates Gear 5th, there is a moment where Kaido literally talks about how Luffy, this is something he's never seen before. He's seen someone use both armament and Conqueror's Haki imbuement. And even though that whole point, he mentions imbuement, but he never actually talks about hardening. Because in most of that fight, Luffy, when he's in Gear 5th, he's never shown to be black. In fact, he's quite the opposite because he's now turned all white. And so it's interesting how Kaido says that comment. And it kind of shows that there are differing levels of armament haki and that you can use armament haki without turning black. And so, yeah, one might say, well, this is proof that people can't see it. But I think it really just shows that there are differing degrees to what armament haki can be. You can use armament haki to sort of enhance your strength, but it never and defense, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to turn black until, and that's really the key here, is that you can use armament haki anytime, but it doesn't actually appear black until you use hardening or koka. And it's just really, yeah, I think it's just more so the fact that it shows the differing degrees. At least that's my way of looking at that scene. But other than that, yeah, there are other pieces of evidence that maybe show that, yes, people can see the black. But I think between the first two, it's pretty clear that people can see the black coating. But yeah, let me know what you think. I do think that there is some more room for debate, especially with how inconsistent Oda is with haki. I mean, not just armament haki, but he's also inconsistent with how Conqueror's haki looks. People often point to the fact that, black lightning means automatically that Conqueror's haki is being used, but there are a lot of examples where it's just not the case, and it's very confusing. And I think, like with everything else in One Piece with Oda, he just does things that look cool and will sometimes sacrifice to an extent logic and canon and just consistency to make something look cool. And ultimately, I don't really care too much about that either. I think it bothers a lot of people that really like to have that consistency, and maybe the people that are really into power scaling and all of that stuff. But I mean, for me, if the story's good and it looks cool and it doesn't contradict something so heavily that it just makes it break my immersion of the story, and ultimately, I don't really care. So far, I have never really thought to myself, does it matter if they can see the black coating or not? I know a lot of memes are made because of the coating, especially with Gear 4th Luffy and how he'd look without the swirling black, coating things that he has, that pattern he has on his arms and shoulders and torso. So yeah, I don't know. It's just a fun thing to think about, but that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about before I start rambling more. Anyways, thanks for listening, and see you later.